Syracuse game in the rearview mirror. Let's talk about what's next. Obviously, the Clemson game looms large, but in looking at the college football playoff selection committee rankings from December 1st, this is last week's. Alabama crushed LSU. That game was never close. Of course, Notre Dame got the win over Syracuse. Clemson struggled a little bit at times against Virginia Tech, but really pulled away in the second half. Ohio State demolished Michigan State. Texas A&M 11-point win over Auburn. Florida rolled Tennessee, and I believe it was Cincinnati had a bye week. So there's your top 7. So everyone's holding serve, but man, ever since Notre Dame beat Clemson on November 7th, guys, we basically have been saying, well, if Notre Dame takes care of Syracuse and Wake and BC and North Carolina, of course the Wake game's canceled, but if Notre Dame wins out from here, they might not even need to beat Clemson. So I'll ask Patrick this first. What is your take on, has Notre Dame unofficially already cemented its spot in the playoff?
Well, I'll say this and to start in that I don't really see a lot of upside in the result of the ACC championship game. Because, I mean, if you look at where they're at now, let's just say all of a sudden, I don't know, Notre Dame couldn't play the game for obvious reasons or whatever reason, just for a minute. You'd think, all right, how are they going to drop them 3 spots out of the playoff with the resume they have now, right? So either you win and you go from already in to already in, or you lose and it's at least a little more dubious. So the question comes into your mind, what happens? Now, I'm not saying pull out of the game or any stupid suggestions like that, but even with a loss, yes, I think they've done enough. I think we'll see that reflected. The only thing is just don't get completely run off the field, steamrolled like what Alabama did to LSU or something. Or, yeah, I know, Mike, like you mentioned, the Clemson-Virginia Tech game was close for a minute in the first half there, but it was 45-10. That's not going to look good either. Just don't have that happen, and they'll be, I think, safely. And it's just hard to see that even with that loss, which would be to another playoff team, and let's say, again, Clemson beats Notre Dame, just, again, for the sake of the question. Clemson and Notre Dame would be the only teams in the top 4 with a win over another top 4 team. And I know it's kind of hard to do because, well, if you lose, it's pretty hard to be in the top 4. But nonetheless, those losses are rare. And for you to be able to claim one says a lot about your resume as a fellow top 4 team. So I don't know. It's not anything that would be a black mark if they were to lose in the ACC championship game. I just find it hard to see that even with that there's going to be 4 better bodies of work, 4 teams that I know we hear about it to ad nauseum this year have a eye tested better. I don't know. I think they all but locked it up with Saturday's win, and mainly because I don't see a situation where they get run off the field by Clemson.
Yeah, I would agree with that overall. I think the only other fly in the ointment, perhaps, that could occur is if Florida defeats Alabama in the SEC championship game. Then Alabama's still getting in no matter what. Florida has to get in because it's the SEC champion that just beat number 1. And then if Clemson does beat Notre Dame, they're in. So then it becomes a choice between a 10-1 Notre Dame team or an Ohio State team that played maybe just 6 games or so. And I would like to think in that situation, the committee would still recognize that, hey, Notre Dame played almost double the amount of games, number 1. And number 2, they have maybe, along with Clemson possibly beating Notre Dame, one of the 2 best wins in the country this season. So I think, yes, it's pretty much all but cemented. Again, unless you have that type of performance in the ACC championship game where the doors are blown off you. And I just don't see that happening with this Notre Dame team, as mentally and physically tough as they are.
when I initially answered Mike's question, I'm just kind of, again, for the sake of the question, just assuming Alabama wins for a minute. Of course, Florida winning would give them a win over a top 4 team, but I don't really even look at that as this thing that could really spoil it, just because I don't know. I don't think it's much of a decision between what would be a 10-1 Notre Dame and what would be a 6 or 7. I've lost track of how many games each of these teams has gotten postponed by now. 7-0 or 6-0 Ohio State. Like, I just don't. I mean, look, I know you have lack of conference or non-conference games and methods of comparing conferences and whatnot, and this is a tricky thing, but like the games have to matter, and it just seems not at all ignoring that, and not at all within what we're trying to do here to put in a Ohio State team based on eye test. And look, as a Northwestern graduate, I will even say this. I don't think like the Northwestern win in the Big Ten title game Ohio State could get, if it gets there, would be anything near this. Like, oh, this thing is a bold-faced 45-point font on a resume that just catapults you in. I don't know. I don't see this. And again, I say this as someone with a ton of respect and admiration for everything that Pat Fitzgerald does and what Northwestern and et cetera, et cetera. But I don't know. Like, the games have to matter. And I just don't see how, when considering that as you should, that's going to be that much of a decision, should it even come down to that, for the playoff committee if Alabama loses.
I guess my question is, all right, if Notre Dame loses, they still should be in. Yes, I think we all 3 agree on that. Also with the point of, but they can't get their doors blown off. What is the number on that? Is it 3 touchdowns? Is it 4 touchdowns? If as long as they lose by 30 or less, we think they're good. Like, Patrick, what do you think that number is?
I don't want to put a hard number on it because score margins can lie. I mean, was the Cotton Bowl really a 27-point game? Probably not, right? I don't know. I guess the Clemson win over Virginia Tech was a 5-touchdown game, but by the end, it didn't really feel like it. I don't know. I just ranted against the eye test, but just, you have to watch the game a little bit to see what really unfolds. And if, all right, Notre Dame puts a bunch of garbage time points and win, or only loses by 17, like, they'll see through that. Just as on the other side of the coin, I think, all right, let's say they lose by 24, but the whole thing was, or maybe, I don't know, 21, but it was a 7-point game until there was 5 minutes left or something, and someone backdoor covers and backdoors their way into a 3-score game. They'll see that too. So I don't know. I guess when you get up into the 30s and it's like, yeah, no matter what, that's not going to lie. But I don't know. I think there's some wiggle room in there as far as, the scoring margin can lie, where, all right, a 3-score loss doesn't look quite as bad, or a slightly bigger margin doesn't look as worse. Or you know what I mean here. I don't know. There's some, I don't think you can just put a number on it and say, all right, they're over. See you later.
Notre Dame beats Clemson again. How could we not be the number 1 seed? Does the media all of a sudden say Clemson is not as good as their ranking? We touched on this earlier, guys. I think if Notre Dame beats Clemson, their best shot at the 1 is if Alabama loses. All right, if Alabama and Notre Dame win, I have a hard time seeing Notre Dame jumping them, because now that Clemson win's not as good, because Clemson's got 2 losses, and then, like I said earlier, Alabama also has that Texas A&M win, which they're probably going to finish the season as a 1-loss team, and probably at number 5, because you have Florida falling out. Clemson will fall out, so Texas A&M will naturally move up. So maybe if Notre Dame just blows the doors off Clemson, maybe that's their best shot. I don't see them, the committee, having Notre Dame jump Alabama unless the Crimson Tide lose. Patrick, what do you think?
To answer the question of how could Notre Dame not be the number 1 seed, I don't know. I'd just be preferring Alabama's resume and body of work more. I would understand that, even though I think it'd be a little disingenuous to say, oh, well, now Clemson has 2 losses. They're bad. Like, no, they had 2 losses to a team that would be at worst top 2, and I mean, I think is good enough to hang with Alabama at the very least. So I don't think it would be a situation where it's all of a sudden let's start discrediting that win, where you can look at, oh yeah, Clemson against everybody else is hammering everybody, well, except Boston College. But Lou, going back to your point about those 3 games where not everything is at their sharpest. Yeah, I don't know. I just think it would be like they like Alabama's resume better. There's no reason to drop them. And they've looked better. I mean, have they really had that? Okay, Ole Miss maybe was the one game where it wasn't quite as sharp. I don't know. I'm not saying I necessarily like agree with every single part of that. I'm just trying to think through the logic here of how Notre Dame wouldn't be number 1 if they do beat Clemson.
Alabama's not going to fall from number 1 if they win the SEC championship against Florida, period. I mean, I think, and part of it, I think there's just subconsciously, hey, these guys have won 5 national championships since 2009. They're competing for the national championship every year. You've got to prove you're better than Alabama on the field. And it really doesn't matter if Alabama's the 1 seed and Notre Dame is 2, because 2 plays 3 and 1 plays 4. So it's not like it really matters. If you're better than them, prove it, hopefully in the playoff, whether it's in the championship game or in the semifinal. But it's sort of, when I was growing up, the theme always was that a small football player has to prove he can play football, and a big guy has to prove he can't. And that's the same principle with Alabama. It's like they're the big guy on the block, and until somebody else does it, they're going to be always at that number 1 unless proven otherwise.